In today's video, I'm going to show you the 3 core steps that you need to safely get off antidepressants. You're also going to learn how to do this in the fastest possible way that's safe for you, while also experiencing the fewest withdrawal symptoms. And not only that, I'm going to show you all the equipment that you need and where to find it. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because honestly, 99% of doctors don't really know how to do this properly. And the result? Well, it's that most patients are given the wrong advice and they end up failing their tapers and suffering from severe withdrawal symptoms that were completely avoidable. But here's the truth. Safely tapering off isn't complicated if you know what to do. And so today I'm going to break down 3 key strategies that make it easy to come off antidepressants. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Josef Witt-Doerring. I'm a psychiatrist and I run the Taper Clinic, which is the largest deprescribing clinic in the world. And I've helped hundreds of patients safely stop their psychiatric medications. Now, you might be scratching your head thinking, well, why do 99% of doctors get this wrong? And I want to quickly explain that. Because the problem is simple. These doctors have been trained to think about withdrawal the wrong way. And this is really one of the darkest chapters in psychiatry. And it didn't happen by accident. Because you see, when the SSRIs first came out, patients immediately began to report that they were having difficulties coming off these medications. And for the drug companies, this was a public relations disaster. They did not want these medications associated with the word addiction or being hard to stop because it would have made doctors more hesitant to prescribe them. So the biggest manufacturer at the time, Eli Lilly, who made Prozac, sponsored something they called a consensus panel. And this is where they got a group of top experts together to produce a paper to educate doctors about the withdrawal problems. But here's what their conclusion was. Their conclusion was that antidepressant withdrawal was mild and self-limiting, meaning that it went away on its own after a couple of weeks. Now, the pharmaceutical companies gave this consensus paper to their army of drug reps, who then went out and flooded doctors' offices, spreading the good news that antidepressants were easy to stop. But here's the truth. This whole thing was actually a lie, because the so-called consensus panel was made up entirely of doctors funded by the same companies that made the drugs. And those doctors, their careers depended on those relationships. And the evidence they used to say it was mild and self-limiting, well, these were based off company-sponsored studies that only went for 12 weeks. Guys, seriously, 12 weeks? That's not even long enough for the brain to fully adapt to being on these drugs. And of course, withdrawal is going to look mild if you only study people who are coming off these drugs after being on them for 3 months. And so those findings don't even relate to the normal group of people who take these medications. Because right now, of the 15% of Americans who take antidepressants, 70% of them have been on them for 2 years or more. And getting off after several years on these medications is a completely different story. Now, it's also really important to talk about the consequences that this misinformation has had on patients, because the result was that most doctors told their patients that they could taper in a couple of months. You know, after all, if you were told that withdrawal is mild and short-lived, why prolong it? Just rip the Band-Aid off, get it over and done with. But this was a huge mistake, because when you pull people off these medications too quickly, like they were trained to do, it really is like playing Russian roulette with your brain. Let me explain why. Now, having been a psychiatrist for over 10 years, I've seen a lot of rapid withdrawals, withdrawals that take place over a couple of months. And 3 things happen, and I want to go through them quickly. Now, here's the first thing that happens. Well, the doctor tapers the patient super quickly. The patient experiences severe withdrawal symptoms. The doctor, believing that withdrawal is mild and self-limiting, thinks to himself, well, this can't be withdrawal. That's not what I was taught it looks like. This must be the original illness coming back. And so what they tell the patient to do is to jump back on the medication. And when the patient gets better, because they are no longer in withdrawal, because they're back on the medication, the patient now thinks that they need to be on this drug. They think that they have a chemical imbalance in their brain that requires lifelong medication, when really they were just tapered too quickly. And so that's the first thing that happens. You can misdiagnose withdrawal as the underlying condition, and then the patient's just stuck on an unwanted medication for the rest of their life. Now, the second thing that can happen is much, much worse, but thankfully it's less common. And this is that the patient can develop a neurological injury called protracted withdrawal. Now, the easiest way for me to explain this is kind of how I see it happen clinically. And so usually what happens is someone will quickly come off a medication, usually in a couple months or sometimes even cold turkey, and they'll experience really bad withdrawal symptoms. But they say to themselves, well, I'm just going to get through this. I want to rip the Band-Aid off. I'm going to kind of white knuckle it. And in a couple of months, it'll go away. And I just don't want to prolong this. And so they do that. But then a month passes and they don't feel better. and then the second month, and they don't feel better. And then month 3 rolls around, and they start to feel even worse. At this point, they say to themselves, I can't do this anymore. It's way too hard. I'm going to jump back on the drug. But what happens when they get back on the drug is that they actually don't get better. They reinstate the medication, and the symptoms don't go away. Usually at this time, the patient thinks that they've contracted some new sort of neurological condition like Lyme disease or multiple sclerosis or something horrible like that. But what's actually happened to them is that they've developed a neurological injury called protracted withdrawal. Now, it's unclear why this only happens in some patients, but for some people, when you go into severe withdrawal and it lasts for, several months, that's actually damaging. It's almost like you've had a neurological injury. And after that injury has set in, there's no real cure for it apart from time. And typically this can take a couple of years to get better. Now, there is one good piece of news. You can actually avoid a protracted withdrawal injury if you do a slow taper and avoid severe withdrawal symptoms. Now, the last thing that happens when people do a quick withdrawal is actually what I see most commonly. It's that people actually bounce back from it pretty well. That's right. It's not all fire and brimstone here. Some people have very elastic brains. They're very neuroplastic. And so when you remove the medication, they feel really bad for a couple of months, but then their brain gets used to being off the drug and they normalize. And this is why you hear so many people say, hey, I came off this medication. It was no problem. My mom was on it. She came off. It was no big deal. This whole withdrawal thing is overblown. That's true. Some people don't have a hard time coming off these meds, even after several years, because their brains are just really elastic. So now that we know the 3 outcomes, you might be feeling a little nervous because 2 of those sounded terrible and only 1 of them really sounded good. And so you might be asking yourself, is there a way to figure out whether you're someone who could come off quickly or you're someone who needs to come off really slowly to avoid those bad outcomes? And that brings us to the next part of the video, because there absolutely is. And this is the first key strategy for coming off these medications safely. And so strategy number 1 when it comes to getting off these antidepressants safely is do not follow a tapering schedule. Now, most patients who taper off antidepressants are told by their doctors or their coaches to follow some kind of fixed schedule. And this can look 2 different ways. It could be a doctor saying, hey, I want you to just halve your medication, wait 2 weeks, halve it again, wait 2 weeks, and halve it again. That's a schedule. That's a fixed reduction every 2 weeks. Or it could be like a super technical taper that you get online where someone says, hey, every couple of weeks, you're going to drop your dose by 5%. Now, both of these approaches are wrong because your brain really does not care about some tapering schedule that you put together in an Excel spreadsheet. What it cares about is its own innate capacity to adapt to the removal of a medication. I want you to remember this. All brains can accommodate the removal of these drugs differently, and this is just genetic. No one really knows why some brains adapt quickly to getting the drug out and others, it takes a lot longer. And so how do you make sure that you're always moving at the right speed for you? Well, you do this by listening to how your body responds to each reduction and then adapting the next reduction to be a bit larger or a bit smaller. Let me explain how this works. Let's say you're tapering off 100 milligrams of Zoloft and you want to start with a 5% cut, so essentially removing 5 milligrams. And so you do that. Now, after you remove 5 milligrams and you wait 4 weeks, you say to yourself, well, that was actually pretty easy. I think I'm going to remove 10 milligrams now. And so you do that. And then, 4 weeks later, you say, well, that was actually pretty easy as well. And I actually recovered from that reduction pretty quickly. It only took me about 3 weeks to recover. And so the next step, you might decide to remove 15 milligrams and only wait 3 weeks. Maybe 3 weeks later, the 15 milligram reduction was fine. So you decide to do a 20 milligram reduction. And then, oh my God, all of a sudden you start to have bad withdrawal symptoms. And so you say to yourself, well, now I know that 20 milligrams is too big of a reduction for me. And so after having the bad withdrawal symptoms, and here's how I define that, just so you know, it's okay to have some withdrawal during this, but if the withdrawal ever gets to the point where the symptoms are severe and they start interfering with your ability to work or do your daily activities, that's when it's too much. And so that's when I would say, okay, slow down. And so if that happens to you, what you would do is say, well, I'm going to go back up to the last dose that I was on where I didn't have those symptoms. I'll wait a couple weeks, wait for it to go away. And now I know that that's too large of a reduction. And so my speed is essentially 15 milligrams every 3 weeks. And so I hope that makes sense, because essentially what you're doing is you are just finding the right speed that your brain can adapt to the removal of the drug. And now you know two things. You know that you can change the size of the reduction. It could be 5, 10 milligrams, 15 milligrams, but you can also change the frequency. And really what I recommend to my patients is that you can drop as frequently as every 2 weeks. I wouldn't ever drop any quicker than that, because 2 weeks is usually the minimum amount of time that you need to wait to see how your brain responds to a dose reduction. And so most people end up waiting anywhere from 2 weeks to sometimes 6 weeks. And you can change the amount of time that you take between reductions based on how quickly it takes you to adapt to that last reduction. And so when you base the size of the reductions and the frequency of the reductions off how you respond, this will ensure that you're always going to be tapering at the fastest rate that's actually safe for you. Now, unfortunately, having done this for several years, even patients who understand this concept often fail their taper because they fall off the drug tapering cliff at the end. And so this next section is how to avoid that. Now, the next step in safe tapering is to not fall off the drug tapering cliff. Now, okay, so what the heck does this mean? Now, the drug tapering cliff is a metaphor that I use to describe how the drug quickly jumps off the receptors in the brain when you get to the low doses. And so what are the low doses? Well, the low dose is typically the first dose of the drug that you were put on right at the start. It's the entry level dose. It's usually at around that dose where the drug starts to quickly disengage from the receptors, and it can make people go suddenly into withdrawal. And now, why is this an issue? Well, this is an issue because most doctors assume that if a patient has tolerated, say, a 10 milligram reduction the whole way down, they started on 100 milligrams and each time they've done a 10 milligram reduction and it's fine, many doctors will assume that they can do the same 10 milligram reduction until they're completely off. And I get it. This logic makes sense on paper. They've tolerated it for, the first half of the taper. Why wouldn't it work for the end of the taper? Well, I get how this makes sense logically, but it's completely wrong when you look at it in the context of how these drugs actually bind receptors in the brain. And so what I'm going to do now is actually explain this in two ways. And it might feel a little technical at times, but really it's not. And I'm going to make it super easy for you to understand. What you're looking at on the screen is the receptor binding curve for the drug sertraline. So here on the y-axis, it says receptor occupancy, and this is how much of the drug is binding the receptors in the brain. Now, down here on the x-axis is you have the dose of the drug. Now, what you'll actually notice is we have this kind of upside down hockey stick type graph going on, where it's super duper steep at the lower doses, and then it gets really flat at the higher doses. Okay, so the only thing that I want you to take away from this is that when you get to 50 milligrams, which is this dotted line, 50 milligrams and below, all of a sudden this curve is getting really steep. Now, I bring up the 50 milligrams because that's like the low entry-level dose of sertraline. Now, what this steep line means here is it means as you go below 50 milligrams, you're going to start to disengage the receptors at a much faster rate than you were doing reductions higher than that. And this has to do with the principles of receptor saturation, which means when you get to the lower doses of the drug, there's not as much drug around, so when you remove some of it, you're much more likely to quickly disengage the receptors and cause withdrawal. If that seemed kind of abstract and technical to you, don't worry, because we're going to look at some images now that I think is going to make it really clear. So what we're looking at here is two neurons interfacing each other. And then you've got these little U shapes here. These are the receptors on the neuron that the drugs are binding to. And all these little dots that you're seeing in between them are the drug. And so for this example, let's assume you're on the max dose of sertraline and there's lots of drug floating around between the neurons and it's binding the receptors. Well, if you were to remove, 20% of them, you're actually not going to change that much receptor binding because there's so much residual drug around to just jump back on the receptors after you do a reduction. You might even remove another 20% and you'll see, hey, we didn't really disengage the receptors that much because, again, there's still lots of drug left over. You might do it again and all of a sudden, you've you're actually disengaging the receptors more because there's less drug around, but you still tolerated that reduction pretty well because most of the receptors are bound. But if you did that again and removed another 20%, all of a sudden there's not enough excess drug left around and you quickly disengage the receptors and you go into withdrawal. Now, this is exactly why so many people fail the end of their taper, because they think they can continue to make the same reductions at the higher doses that they previously tolerated. And then when they get to the lower doses and they go into severe withdrawal, they give up. They say, oh my God, I can never get off this medication. Or even worse, they say, well, to hell with this. This is too hard. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm just going to jump off and get this over with. Terrible idea. You're going to go into severe withdrawal. And so here's what I need you to do. I need you to expect the slowdown. It is very common for the last quarter of your taper to take just as long as the top 3 quarters. That last bit is where most of the receptor disengagement is going to happen, and you will naturally need to go slower. There is nothing wrong with that, and you simply need to expect that. The second thing is that you need to start to shrink your cuts. And so if you were doing, a 10 milligram reduction, and that's not working anymore, just lessen it. You may need to work your way down to a 5 milligram reduction, or maybe even a 2 milligram reduction. You know how in the first section, we kind of experimented with going a little faster and a little faster? You're going to do the opposite when you get to the lower doses. You're going to slow down the size of the reductions until you find the pace that you can tolerate at the end. And the last thing that you can do is you can extend the intervals between your cuts. You may have been able to tolerate a removal every 2 weeks for the higher parts of your taper, but when you get to that lower part, you might need to stretch that out to every 4 weeks or maybe even 5 weeks. And if you do this, you're going to safely be able to come off the medication. And I want to remind you, you're not dragging anything out. This is just you listening to your biology. And if you follow these steps, I promise you'll be able to safely rappel down the drug tapering cliff and not get stuck at the part where most people give up on coming off their medication. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, Josef, that makes a lot of sense. But how do you actually do this? How do you do all these small reductions? My pills only come in fixed sizes, and how do I make those tiny cuts? Don't worry, I've got you, because that's exactly what we're going to cover next in this final step of how to get off antidepressants safely. Now, step number 3 is called the syringe method. Now, you see, many patients really struggle with tapering because they feel like they're stuck with the tablets that they get from the pharmacy. They think their only option is to snap tablets in half or maybe even quarter them if they're careful. And that's it. And that's a huge problem, because what if you need to make smaller reductions than that? And so some people try and get creative. They shave tiny bits off a pill with a razor blade, and then they weigh the pieces on a kitchen scale to get finer cuts. But this method is also really imprecise and slow, and it's kind of stressful, to be honest. And oftentimes, even like the best scales that you use can't measure those tiny changes accurately. And so what do you do instead? Well, actually, you liquefy the medication. Because you see, many patients and most doctors, they don't realize this, that every antidepressant can be turned into a liquid form. Most of these liquid forms already exist pre-made, and you can get them at the big box pharmacies like Walgreens and CVS. And even if they don't exist pre-made, you can always get your doctor to send a prescription to a compounding pharmacist, where the pharmacist can make a liquid version of the drug for you. It's really pretty simple. The pharmacist orders away for the raw ingredients of your drug, the active ingredient that comes in a powder form, and then they get a suspending agent, which is kind of like water, but it's like a little bit thicker, and then they mix them together and they shake it up, and then the drug is evenly dispersed within that liquid, where you can then draw from to dose. And when you get a liquid version of a drug, it really changes everything, because once your medication is in liquid form, you can measure out tiny, precise doses using a syringe. And so let me give you an example. Let's say, for instance, you have a 5 milligram tablet of Lexapro. And so I've got a bunch of them here. Even if you quarter it, you're only going to get 4 reductions. And so look how hard this is. So I'm going to use my razor here. I'm going to kind of cut it in half. It's not super precise. I'm then going to cut it in half again, and I'm going to cut it, it sort of like crumbles. It goes all over the place, and that's really not that precise, and it's kind of fiddly. But let's say, for instance, I get my doctor to send me a liquid version of this medication, and I say, hey, can you put 5 milligrams of Lexapro into 1 ml. That's like the concentration that we do. What I can do now is actually stick a syringe into the liquid and draw it up. Now, what you're going to notice is if you do it this way, all of a sudden you will have your full dose drawn up in this 1 ml syringes. And do you see this? Do you see all of these lines on the side of the syringe? Well, there's actually 100 of them. And so what this means is that you can actually reduce your dose 1/100th at a time. Now, that's so much more precise than quartering the tablets. But on top of that, it's actually a lot less fiddly as well, because you're just simply sticking a syringe in and you're pulling it up, you're looking at the spaces, and then you're slowly kind of lowering it down. And so let's talk about a practical example of how you might do something like this. Well, you might start with 200 milligrams of sertraline or Zoloft. That's the max dose. And you might find that it's pretty easy for you to drop 25 milligrams at a time. And so you just get your doctor to prescribe the 200 milligrams of sertraline by giving you 4 50 milligram tablets. And you just drop down half of a 50 milligram tablet every 4 weeks. Now, you may find that when you get to 50 milligrams, you can't do that anymore. And so at that point, you ask your doctor to liquefy your medication. You say, can you send a prescription to a compounding pharmacist? And here's exactly what that prescription would look like. Your doctor is going to write this to the pharmacy. Please compound 50 milligrams of sertraline into a 1 ml solution. Patient is going to take 1 ml daily because that's going to be the full 50 milligrams. You can ask the pharmacist to dispense 30 milliliters for a 30-day supply with 5 refills. So that should last you about 6 months. What you're also going to ask them to do is to include an adapter cap for the bottle and a 1 ml syringe. So this just means you don't have to go and buy this stuff. Now, some people might be wondering, what is an adapter cap? Well, I don't actually have one here because I gave it to my staff to do their training. But do you see how this bottle is like totally open here? Usually there's a little cap there which makes this big hole a much smaller hole. And the reason you have an adapter cap, you can sit the syringe in that small hole, and then you can actually invert the bottle upside down without the bottle spilling everywhere. And so when you're doing this, you always want to ask for an adapter cap, because eventually when the bottle gets low, you're going to be turning it upside down and you're going to be sticking the syringe in, you're going to be looking closely and pulling it out. And so that's where you get that equipment. You're actually going to ask the pharmacist for that and they're going to send it to you. And so once you have it in that 50 ml solution, this is what it's going to look like on the way down. If you're drawing up all the way to the 1 milliliter mark, you might decide that the first reduction you're going to do is to 0.9, meaning you're going to remove 5 milligrams. You're going to do a 10% reduction. And you might just wait 4 weeks. That goes fine. You do another one. You wait 4 weeks. That's fine. And so on and so forth. And if at any time during this taper, you find that doing a 5 milligram reduction is too much, just go halfway. Do a 2.5 milligram reduction. Because you see, when you're drawing up your medication with the syringe, it's super easy to do smaller and smaller reductions, and it's really fast to draw up the medication. And you can essentially just use this to get the whole way down and off the medication. All right, guys, that's it for me today. I want to promise you, if you use these 3 techniques, you are going to avoid like 99% of the mistakes that I see in my clinic with bad tapering. You're going to have a much higher chance of successfully coming off your medication and actually doing it with the least amount of withdrawal symptoms. Now, some of this stuff can seem kind of fiddly. I totally get that. But sometimes, like if you do it in the methodical way, it's actually going to be much faster than just like kind of getting off the drug quickly, going into withdrawal, getting back on. Do it the right way. Do it with control. It's safer for your brain, and it's probably going to get you off the medication faster. Now, if you're someone who wants to go deeper on this, or you need more guidance how to taper your specific medication, right below this video, you're going to find my free drug tapering course. It's the exact same material that I use to train the nurse practitioners and psychiatrists who work in my clinic. It takes about 5 hours long, and honestly, it took me like nearly 5 years to make. And it covers every single question you could possibly have about drug tapering. And then finally, if you're in the US and you want expert help with your taper, you can check us out at taperclinic.com and you can see if you're potentially interested in working with us. Now, if you found this video helpful, I'd like to ask you to please like, share, and subscribe. It really helps the channel and it encourages me to keep on making this educational content. Thank you so much.